I've met plenty of people who think they're entitled to boss others around, but the Karen of Pinewood Hills HOA truly exceeded every limit. She called the cops on me simply because I refused to give her free gas from my own family's gas station. Saturday morning. I was alone checking the books at Williams's Gas and Go when a white Cadillac Escalade screeched to a stop out front. Debbie Bailey stepped out, didn't bother with a greeting, and marched straight to the counter like she was conducting an inspection on a violation site. Fill up my tank. Edward, as HOA president, I shouldn't have to pay when a resident has fuel available. I refused. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 as if I'd just held a knife to her throat. I need police assistance. This man is being hostile and threatening me. The smell of gasoline mixed with sheer absurdity hung in the air, and this is exactly why that 911 call would become the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea who she was messing with. The photograph of my father hung slightly crooked on the wall of the small office, just as it had for the past 10 years since he passed. Every morning, I straightened it. Every evening, it tilted again, as if the old man refused to stay perfectly aligned with anything in this world. Williams's Gas and Go had been his dream since 1987, built with calloused hands and a stubborn belief that honest work meant something. I inherited the station, the belief, and apparently, his inability to tolerate nonsense. That Saturday morning, 7:15 sharp, I sat alone behind the counter reconciling last month's receipts. The numbers were good, the silence was better. Ever since winning the mayoral election 3 weeks ago, peace had become a luxury I could rarely afford. The Escalade's engine announced itself before the vehicle even came into view. That particular growl of an oversized SUV driven by someone who believed the world owed them a parking space. I didn't look up immediately. Customers came and went. Most knew how to pump their own gas and pay like civilized adults. The door chimed. Footsteps clicked against the tile with the precision of someone who had practiced looking important. When I finally raised my eyes, Debbie Bailey stood at the counter, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, as though my very existence had somehow violated a regulation she hadn't yet invented. Edward, she didn't phrase it as a greeting, more like a verdict. Fill up my Escalade, premium, and before you ask, this falls under community courtesy for HOA leadership. Your father understood that arrangement perfectly well. I set down my pen. My father never gave away a single gallon without documentation. There was no Debbie Bailey anywhere in 30 years of records. But what struck me wasn't the lie itself. It was the absolute certainty in her voice. The comfort of someone who had rewritten history so many times she'd forgotten which version was real. I considered my options. Confrontation would give her exactly what she wanted, a scene she could spin into victimhood. Compliance would set a precedent I'd be paying for the rest of my life in this neighborhood. Mrs. Bailey, the station doesn't have any arrangement with the HOA, never has. If you'd like to purchase fuel, I'm happy to assist you at the posted price. Her expression shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to confusion, as though a vending machine had suddenly demanded she say please. She tilted her head, recalculating. I don't think you understand how things work around here. I've been president of Pinewood Hills for 8 years. 8 years of keeping this community running smoothly. Your father and I had an understanding. There's no understanding. The price is posted. The confusion curdled into something sharper. Her voice dropped half an octave. The way people speak when they're about to issue a threat they want you to remember. Do you know what I can do to someone who refuses to cooperate with community leadership? I can make your life in Pinewood Hills very, very uncomfortable. Inspections, violations, fines for things you didn't even know were against the rules. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. I'm giving you a chance to start this relationship on the right foot. Edward, I suggest you take it. I've been a lawyer for 15 years. I've sat across from people who thought intimidation was a negotiation tactic. Some of them were genuinely dangerous. Debbie Bailey was not dangerous. She was something worse. She was convinced of her own righteousness. The price is $4.29 per gallon for premium. That's the only offer available. She stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then she pulled out her phone. Her thumb moved with practiced efficiency. I heard the familiar 3 tones of a 911 call connecting. Yes, hello. I need police assistance at Williams's Gas and Go on Pinewood Road. There's a man here being hostile and threatening me. I feel unsafe." She kept her eyes locked on mine while she spoke, performing for an audience that wasn't there yet. The dispatcher asked questions. She answered with strategic vagueness. Hostile demeanor, aggressive refusal of service, possible discrimination. When she hung up, she smiled again. "You should have just filled the tank. Edward." 8 minutes. That's how long it took for the patrol car to arrive. Officer Bobby Pullman stepped out, hand resting near his belt, scanning the scene for the violent threat Debbie had promised. He found a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt, standing behind a gas station counter. Not exactly a crime scene. "Ma'am, you reported a disturbance." Debbie launched into her narrative. Threatening behavior. Discriminatory refusal. She felt genuinely frightened for her safety. I let her finish without interruption. When she was done, I spoke calmly. "Officer, every inch of this station is monitored by security cameras, video and audio. If you'd like to review the footage of our entire interaction, I can pull it up right now." Pullman's pen stopped moving. He glanced at Debbie, then back at me, and I caught something in the gesture, not confusion, but a kind of weary familiarity. The look of a man who had responded to Pinewood Hills calls before, and learned that involvement only led to paperwork and phone calls from people who knew his captain's name. He tucked the notepad into his pocket without writing anything further. Debbie jumped in quickly, waving her hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary. I just wanted this incident documented. For the HOA's records." She gathered her purse, straightened her jacket, and headed for the door. Before stepping out, she turned back. Her voice carried clearly across the empty station. "The HOA meeting is on Thursday. Mr. Williams, I'd recommend you attend. We have several matters concerning your property to discuss." The Escalade roared to life and disappeared down Pinewood Road. Pullman lingered a moment longer, eyes flicking toward the security camera above the register. He said nothing, just nodded vaguely and returned to his cruiser. I watched him drive away, then locked the front door and walked back to the office. The laptop took 30 seconds to boot up. I logged into the security system and began downloading every file from the past 2 hours. The footage would be backed up to cloud storage within the hour. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Welcome to Pinewood Hills. You just picked the wrong enemy." I didn't respond. I screenshotted the message, noted the timestamp, and saved it to a folder I'd just created. The folder was named Timeline. My father's photograph hung from the wall, still slightly crooked. She thought this was a battle over emotion. She was wrong. This was a battle over documentation. And I had just started building my file. 4 days passed before the official response arrived. The envelope sat in my mailbox between a utility bill and a furniture catalog. Its return address printed in bold letters that practically shouted importance. Pinewood Hills, Homeowners Association, Office of the President. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and opened it with the same detachment I'd use for any legal correspondence. The letterhead featured a tasteful pine tree logo. The language featured something considerably less tasteful. The letter informed me of a formal violation under Article 7.3 of the Pinewood Hills CC&Rs, described as conduct detrimental to community harmony. I was required to appear before the HOA board at the regularly scheduled meeting on Thursday to address this matter. A preliminary fine of $500 had been assessed, with a warning that failure to appear would result in an increased penalty of $1,000. I pulled up the Pinewood Hills governing documents on my laptop. The CC&Rs spanned 47 pages of dense legal language, the kind of document most homeowners signed without reading. Article 7.3 was buried on page 23, and 5 words told me everything I needed to know in the judgment of the board. That phrase meant Debbie Bailey could punish anyone for anything, as long as she convinced 2 other members to agree. No objective standard, no appeal process, just her judgment, wrapped in procedural legitimacy. I kept scrolling. Article 12.7 caught my attention. It allowed residents to request a formal financial audit if a petition bearing signatures from 15% of homeowners was submitted. 15% of 127 households meant 19 signatures. I wrote that number down and circled it. The next morning, I stopped at the grocery store on Maple Street. Mrs. Patterson at the register had always greeted me by name, asked about the station, and commented on the weather. This time, She rang up my items in silence. Her eyes stayed fixed on the scanner, never meeting mine. Two women in the cereal aisle stopped their conversation as I passed, their voices dropping to whispers that resumed only after I'd turned the corner. Outside, I sat in my car for a moment. The information ecosystem of Pinewood Hills had already begun to shift. Debbie hadn't accused me publicly. She didn't need to. She had simply planted seeds in the right ears and let the community's natural currents carry them forward, transforming me from new neighbor into cautionary tale without saying a word on the record. Thursday arrived with the weight of inevitability. The HOA meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a modest building that smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. I arrived 5 minutes early and found the room already crowded, 32 residents by my count, nearly triple the usual attendance. Harold Jenkins sat in the back corner, arms crossed, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. Debbie occupied the center seat at the front table, flanked by two board members who nodded at everything she said. Two others sat at the edges, their posture suggesting discomfort with the evening's agenda. She called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp, announcing a special matter before the regular agenda. She explained this wasn't about punishment, but about expectations, noting that our community thrives because we support each other. When someone refuses to participate in that spirit, it affects everyone. She turned to me with patient concern and informed me I had 3 minutes. I stood. I explained that Mrs. Bailey came to my gas station and demanded free fuel, claiming an arrangement with my late father that never existed. When I declined, she called the police and filed a report claiming I had threatened her. I noted that the entire interaction was recorded on security cameras, and I was prepared to share footage with anyone who wished. The room stirred. Debbie raised her hand, and the murmur died. She acknowledged that perspectives can differ, and she wasn't here to assign blame, only to help the community move forward. She noted that several residents had expressed concern about neighborly engagement, and Article 7.3 existed precisely to address matters of harmony. Her tone remained measured throughout, never accusing, simply guiding the room toward a conclusion she had already determined. She called for a vote. 3 hands rose immediately. A pause followed. One dissenting member, a gray-haired woman, stared at the table before slowly raising her hand partway, then lowering it again. She kept her eyes on her notepad. The other dissenter shook his head quietly. 3-2, $500 for refusing to give away my own property. Debbie made a note, then mentioned that several residents had raised questions about the gas station's impact on traffic and aesthetics. The board might review whether the property requires adjustments. The station sat outside the HOA jurisdiction. She knew that, but her phrasing left just enough ambiguity for doubt among those who didn't know the boundaries. She adjourned at 7:42 with a reminder about the fall festival, shifting from tribunal to community calendar as though my judgment had been routine business. Harold Jenkins waited until the room emptied, then walked past me toward the door. As he passed, he pressed a folded paper into my hand. I didn't look until I reached my car. 3 words in cramped handwriting: check the finances. I sat in the parking lot, engine off, watching the clubhouse lights flicker out. The fine meant nothing. $500 was an inconvenience, but the vote meant everything. It meant the system was designed to produce exactly this outcome, regardless of evidence. Debbie had spent 8 years perfecting a machine that converted procedure into power. At home, I opened my laptop and stared at a draft email to the North Carolina Attorney General's office. Not yet. The file wasn't complete. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet: date, event, potential legal violation, evidence, witnesses. She believed this was about opinion, about making me uncomfortable enough to leave. She was wrong. This was about documentation, and I had just started building my case. 3 days after the meeting, another envelope arrived. Same letterhead, same bold return address. This time, the violation was Article 4.2, failure to maintain property to community standards. The evidence consisted of 4 photographs showing fallen leaves on my front lawn. I examined the images carefully. The leaves were from the oak tree in my neighbor's yard, blown onto my property overnight by wind that had swept through Cedarville the previous evening. The fine was $200, due within 14 days. I added the letter to a folder that was growing thicker by the day. Each letter, each fine, each official notice created a documented history of a problem resident. When enough paper accumulated, The narrative would write itself, but paper cuts both ways. The impact on the station became measurable within a week. I kept meticulous records, just as my father had, tracking daily transactions against the same periods from previous months. Traffic was down 31%. Regular customers who had filled up every Tuesday now drove past without stopping. I watched their cars through the office window, saw some of them glance toward the pumps before accelerating away. Not everyone abandoned me. Mrs. Martha Flores, 72 years old and no relation despite the shared surname, still came every Wednesday afternoon for gas and a cup of coffee from our small machine. She handed me exact change and lowered her voice. She told me that Debbie was telling people I had been aggressive with her, that I had screamed and made threats. Martha said she didn't believe it, but many people did, because Debbie had been here for years, and I had been here for months. I thanked her and said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. Tommy, my 22-year-old employee, arrived for his shift that Friday with a troubled expression. He told me someone had called him at home, offering a job at a service station 2 towns over. Better pay, they said, more stable environment. When Tommy asked how they got his number, the caller hung up. I asked Tommy what he wanted to do. He shrugged and said he liked working here, that my father had given him his first job, and he wasn't going to abandon the family business because of some phone calls. I gave him a raise that afternoon, small but meaningful. Loyalty deserved recognition, especially when it was becoming rare. The same evening, a review appeared on a local business directory. 1 star, posted by an account created that same day. Rude owner, discriminatory behavior, unsafe environment for families, no specific incident, no verifiable details. I screenshotted the review, noted the timestamp, and saved it without responding. 2 more reviews appeared over the following days, with similar language, similar new accounts. I documented each one and moved on. That evening, a knock came at my front door. Harold Jenkins stood on the porch, holding a cardboard box that looked older than some of my furniture. He apologized for the late hour, but said this couldn't wait. I invited him inside. He set the box on my kitchen table and explained that he had lived in Pinewood Hills for 23 years. He had watched 4 families receive the same treatment I was receiving. Violations, fines, social pressure. All 4 had sold their homes and moved away within a year. I asked him why he was telling me this. He opened the box. Inside were photocopies of HOA meeting minutes and financial statements dating back to 2019. Harold explained that he made copies of every document distributed at meetings because he didn't trust the digital records. He pulled out a specific folder and handed it to me. The documents showed expenditures that didn't match visible improvements. In 2020, the HOA had spent $47,000 on clubhouse renovations. Harold pointed at the building through my window. Same carpet, same furniture, same flickering lights I'd sat under 4 days ago. The money went somewhere, but not into that building. I looked at the vendor name on the invoices: Bailey Property Services, Bradley Bailey's company, Debbie's husband. I flipped through more pages: landscaping contracts, maintenance fees, reserve fund transfers, different years, different line items, same destination. The total exceeded $120,000. I asked Harold if anyone else knew about this. He shook his head. People here didn't ask questions, he said. They just paid their dues and hoped they weren't next. I photographed every page that night and uploaded the images to secure cloud storage. Then I returned the originals to Harold's box. He would keep them safe. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Cedarville City Hall. A voice reminded me that my inauguration ceremony was scheduled for 10 days from now, October 28th at 10 in the morning. They asked if I had any special requests for the event. I told them only one thing: please don't include my residential address in any press materials. They agreed without asking why. I hung up and sat in the darkness of my living room. Through the window, I could see the streetlights of Pinewood Hills, the neat rows of houses where my neighbors were slowly being convinced that I was the enemy. I opened my laptop. The evidence spreadsheet now had 14 entries across 7 columns. I added 3 more: the latest fine, the coordinated reviews, and the financial discrepancies Harold had uncovered. For each entry, I typed the date, the source, the potential legal implications, and the file names of supporting documents. When I finished, I created a new folder and labeled it with tomorrow's date. Inside, I placed a draft letter to a forensic accountant I'd worked with years ago on a civil case. The letter requested a preliminary assessment of the HOA's financial records. I didn't send it yet. There would be a right moment, and this wasn't it. But the letter existed now, ready to move when the time came. I closed the laptop and looked at my father's photograph on the wall. He had taught me that patience wasn't weakness. Patience was preparation. Outside, the neighborhood slept peacefully, unaware that the ground beneath it had already begun to shift. 6 days before the inauguration, I sat at my kitchen table at 5 a.m, 3 documents spread before me. The first was a formal request under the North Carolina Public Records Law, addressed to the Pinewood Hills HOA, demanding all meeting minutes, financial statements, and vendor contracts from the past 3 years. The law required a response within 10 business days. Refusal would constitute a reportable violation to the state attorney general. The second document was a petition for a financial audit under Article 12.7, bearing 22 signatures I had collected over 4 days. Harold Jenkins had been first, Mrs. Martha Flores had been second. The rest came from quiet conversations at doorsteps with residents who had their own grievances but had never found a way to voice them. The third was an email to the North Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, outlining concerns about potential financial mismanagement. I sent all 3 before the sun fully rose. The email disappeared into the digital queue of a state office that processed hundreds of similar complaints each month. The public records request went via certified mail with delivery confirmation. The audit petition I would deliver personally to Debbie Bailey's home, the HOA's registered address. Harold agreed to accompany me as a witness. We arrived at 9 a.m, a time when I knew she would be home, but her husband would be at the dealership. She answered the door in a silk robe, coffee cup in hand, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something harder when she saw what I was holding. I informed her that I was submitting a formal petition for financial audit under Article 12.7, signed by 22 property owners, and asked her to sign the delivery receipt. She stared at the document for a long moment. Then she signed without a word and closed the door in our faces. Harold didn't speak until we were halfway down the block. He said that was the first time in 8 years he had seen Debbie Bailey speechless. That afternoon, I reviewed security footage from the previous week. Most of it was routine, customers coming and going, Tommy is wiping down pumps. But one segment stood out. 3 nights ago, at 2:17 in the morning, a figure had walked slowly around the perimeter of the station. Dark clothing, baseball cap pulled low. The gait was distinctive. I had seen that walk before, at the HOA meeting, when Officer Bobby Pullman had lingered by the door after everyone else left. I couldn't prove it was him. The footage wasn't clear enough for facial identification, but I saved the file, noted the timestamp, and added it to my record surveillance or intimidation. Identity unconfirmed, further observation needed. The next morning, I installed 2 additional cameras at angles that would capture clearer images of anyone approaching the property after hours. Debbie's response came faster than I expected. Not officially. Officially, the HOA had 30 days to schedule the audit, but the community grapevine began humming within hours. Tommy heard it at the diner on Main Street. People were saying I was trying to destroy the HOA, that I had a vendetta against community leadership, that I was an outsider who didn't understand how things worked. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. I wasn't a resident exercising legitimate oversight rights. I was an aggressor. That evening, my mailbox contained a hand-delivered envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Troublemakers don't last long here." I photographed it, bagged it in a plastic sleeve to preserve any fingerprints, and filed it. Anonymous threats suggested something new, not confidence, urgency. The following afternoon, Debbie's Escalade pulled into the gas station lot and parked away from the pumps, in a spot chosen for conversation rather than commerce. I watched her approach through the window and tapped the record button on my phone before slipping it into my shirt pocket. Microphone facing outward, one-party consent. She walked inside with a different demeanor than before. No demands this time. Instead, she wore an expression of wounded reasonableness, the face of someone who had been terribly misunderstood. She told me she thought we had gotten off on the wrong foot. She acknowledged that perhaps she had been too aggressive. She suggested we could find a mutually beneficial arrangement. If I withdrew the audit petition and dropped my complaints to the state, she would ensure all pending fines were dismissed. Additionally, she could encourage residents to support local businesses again. She smiled as though offering a gift rather than a transaction. I asked her to clarify what she meant by mutually beneficial. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. A monthly contribution to the HOA Community Improvement Fund, $500, a gesture of goodwill. In return, I would find Pinewood Hills a much friendlier place. She straightened up, clearly confident she had found my price. I told her I appreciated her coming by and needed time to consider. She nodded, satisfied, and said she would expect an answer within 48 hours. She left without buying anything. I watched her Escalade disappear, then stopped the recording and uploaded it to cloud storage. I sent a copy to my lawyer with a single question. Does this constitute extortion under North Carolina General Statutes, Chapter 14? His response came 2 hours later, possibly. Combined with other evidence of coercion and financial impropriety, it could become part of a larger case. He recommended I continue documenting and avoid anything that could be construed as entrapment. That night, a notification appeared on the neighborhood message board. A new post from Debbie Bailey reminder that the special assessment deadline was October 30th. Households that had not paid the $400 fee would be subject to late penalties of $150 per day. The post tagged 3 addresses by name. Mine was listed first. I read it twice. In 8 years of running Pinewood Hills, Debbie had never publicly named delinquent accounts. The information had always flowed through private letters, quiet phone calls, whispered conversations at community events. This was different. This was pressure applied in daylight, where everyone could see. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She was accelerating. 48 hours, she had said. The deadline on the assessment was 5 days away. The inauguration was 6. Everything was converging toward a point neither of us could yet see clearly. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere across Pinewood Hills, Debbie Bailey was making her own calculations. Time was running out, for both of us. 4 days before the inauguration, I woke to 17 missed calls and a text from a former colleague at my old law firm. 2 words checked the Gazette. I pulled up the Cedarville Gazette website on my phone, still half asleep, and felt the floor drop out from under me. The headline sat at the top of the local news section, questions arise about mayor-elect's fitness for office. The subheadline was worse neighbors describe pattern of hostile behavior. The article cited anonymous sources from Pinewood Hills who described me as confrontational, aggressive, and unwilling to participate in community life. One source claimed I had screamed at a woman who simply asked for assistance. Another suggested my business practices were under scrutiny by residents concerned about neighborhood safety. The article concluded with a question that landed like a knife if a man cannot live peacefully among his own neighbors. Can he be trusted to lead an entire town? I read the article 3 times, searching for any specific claim I could directly refute. There were none. Every accusation was wrapped in vague language and attributed to unnamed residents. The reporter had not contacted me for comment before publication. The timestamp showed 6 in the morning, time to catch the breakfast crowd scrolling through local news. By 8 o'clock, it had been shared over 200 times. Comments accumulated beneath it, a mixture of skepticism and outrage, some defending me as a newcomer being unfairly targeted, others declaring that where there was smoke, there was fire. My phone buzzed continuously. Council members wanted to know if the allegations were true. Supporters are asking how they could help. A few people I barely knew were offering unsolicited advice about damage control. I responded to none of them. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. The impact rippled through the day like waves from a stone dropped in still water. At the station, Tommy reported that 3 scheduled fuel deliveries had been canceled by suppliers, citing logistical issues. When he pressed for details, the dispatcher admitted they had received calls questioning whether Williams's Gas and Go was a stable business partner. 2 customers who had returned after the initial boycott reversed course again, driving past without stopping. I watched them from the office window, their faces turned deliberately away. The isolation was becoming physical now. a boundary drawn around me that grew tighter with each passing hour. Debbie didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to create enough doubt that people would distance themselves preemptively. By the time the truth emerged, if it ever did, the damage would already be permanent. That evening, I sat alone in the station office after closing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My father's photograph watched from the wall, still slightly crooked despite my morning adjustment. I had spent 15 years as a lawyer, advising clients through crises, teaching them to separate emotion from strategy. Now I was the client, and the separation felt impossible. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not anger, something deeper. The exhaustion of being misrepresented to people who would never hear my side. The loneliness of fighting an enemy who controlled the narrative. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, letting the silence press against me. Then I straightened my father's photograph, turned off the lights, and drove home through streets that felt darker than usual. 2 pieces of information arrived that night. The first was an email from the North Carolina Attorney General's office, acknowledging receipt of my complaint. The message was polite and procedural, explaining that my concerns had been logged and would be reviewed within 30 business days. 30 days. By then, the inauguration would be over. The Gazette article would have shaped public perception, and Debbie would have had a month to continue her campaign unopposed. The system moved slowly by design. The second piece of information came via text from Harold Jenkins. He had been reviewing the financial documents again and found something he had initially overlooked. In 2021, the HOA had approved an emergency expenditure of $12,000 for parking lot resurfacing at the clubhouse. Harold had walked past that parking lot every day for years. The surface had not changed since 2018. He had photographs to prove it. I called Harold immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice low as though afraid of being overheard in his own home. He explained that he had compared the vendor invoice to public business records. The company listed as performing the resurfacing work did not exist. The address on the invoice was a vacant lot on the outskirts of Cedarville. The check had been deposited into an account that Harold could not trace, but the routing suggested a connection to the same network of Bailey-controlled entities we had already identified. I asked Harold to send me everything he had. He agreed and hung up quickly. 10 minutes later, my inbox contained scanned images of invoices, canceled checks, and photographs time-stamped over 3 years showing the unchanged parking lot surface. I downloaded each file, verified the metadata, and organized them into a subfolder labeled with the date and a single-word vendors. I sat in my living room, laptop glowing in the darkness. The Attorney General's office would take 30 days. The audit petition would take 30 more, but the documents in front of me told a different story than HOA overreach and procedural abuse. Phantom companies, fabricated invoices, money paid for work that was never performed. I opened a new browser tab and searched for the contact information of a forensic accountant I had worked with years ago on an embezzlement case. I drafted a message requesting an urgent consultation, attached a summary of the financial irregularities, and saved it without sending. Then I opened my evidence spreadsheet and added 3 new entries: the Gazette article with its timestamp and URL, the Attorney General's acknowledgement letter, and Harold's discovery with cross-references to supporting documents. My phone buzzed. A text from Debbie Bailey. "I haven't received your answer. I trust you're making the right decision." I read it once, set the phone face down on the table, and returned to the spreadsheet. There was more work to do before morning, 2 days before the inauguration. The evidence spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle, finally revealing its complete picture: Harold's documents, the security footage, the audio recording, the fabricated invoices. The anonymous threat letter. Rita Santos had appeared at my door the previous evening, eyes red, hands trembling, carrying something I hadn't expected: proof that Debbie Bailey had crossed a line even she couldn't explain away. Rita had been my neighbor for 6 months, one of the faces that turned away when I passed, one of the signatures I assumed belonged to Debbie's loyal coalition. She stood on my porch apologizing for 10 minutes before I understood what she was trying to say. Debbie had pressured her into signing a formal complaint against me, a document Rita hadn't fully read before adding her name. The complaint accused me of threatening behavior and creating a hostile environment. Rita only discovered the contents after the Gazette article appeared and recognized her own words, twisted and anonymized, feeding a narrative she had never intended to support. I invited her inside and listened without interruption. She explained that when she tried to contact Debbie about withdrawing her statement, the response had been immediate and unmistakable. Debbie warned her that retracting the complaint would be seen as disloyalty to the community. Households that undermined HOA leadership often found themselves facing unexpected violations. Fines accumulated quickly. Life in Pinewood Hills could become very uncomfortable for people who didn't understand how things worked. Rita had saved every message. She handed me her phone with shaking hands, and I scrolled through a thread that documented coercion in plain language. No ambiguity, no plausible deniability, just direct threats from the HOA president to a resident who wanted to tell the truth. I photographed each message, thanked Rita for her courage, and promised that her name would not appear in anything without her explicit consent. She left looking lighter than when she arrived, as though confession had lifted something heavy from her shoulders. Now, along with the accumulated weight of weeks of documentation, I assessed what I had. The security footage from the gas station showed Debbie demanding free fuel and calling the police when refused. The audio recording captured her offering to dismiss fines in exchange for monthly payments, a transaction that met the statutory definition of extortion. Harold's financial documents revealed over $120,000 paid to Bailey-controlled vendors for work that was never performed, including invoices from companies that didn't exist. Rita's text messages proved witness intimidation, an attempt to silence someone who wanted to correct false statements. The HOA's refusal to comply with my public records request constituted a violation of state law, and beneath it all ran a 4-year pattern of similar behavior toward other residents, documented in meeting minutes that Debbie thought she controlled, but Harold had quietly preserved. The picture was complete. The question was what to do with it. The inauguration was 48 hours away. I could release everything now, send the documents to the Gazette, file formal complaints with every relevant agency, let the story explode across Cedarville before I take the oath of office. The temptation was real. After weeks of isolation, false accusations, and watching my reputation dissolve in the hands of someone who manufactured reality for her own benefit, the idea of immediate vindication carried a powerful appeal. But I had been a lawyer long enough to understand how narratives formed and how they could be redirected. If I acted now, Debbie would have a ready response. The new mayor, settling personal scores before he even took office. A vendetta disguised as justice. She would become the victim of political persecution, and the evidence, no matter how damning, would be filtered through that lens. Some people would believe her. Enough people might believe her to undermine everything the documents proved. I made a different choice. The inauguration would proceed as scheduled. I would take the oath of office, shake hands, smile for photographs, and say nothing about Pinewood Hills or Debbie Bailey or any of it. Then, as a private citizen exercising rights available to any resident, I would act, not as mayor, not using any authority that came with the position, just as Edward Williams, homeowner, business owner, neighbor. The distinction mattered. It was the difference between justice and revenge, between exposing corruption and abusing power. My father had taught me that integrity wasn't about what you did when people were watching. It was about what you did when you could do otherwise. I opened my laptop and sent a message to my lawyer, prepare the formal complaints. We filed on the 29th, one day after the inauguration. He responded within minutes, confirming he would have everything ready. The next step required more consideration. I drafted an email addressed to every household in Pinewood Hills, 127 addresses that Harold had compiled from years of meeting attendance sheets. The message was brief. I invited all residents to a special community meeting at the clubhouse on Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. The topic was HOA financial transparency. All questions would be answered. All documentation would be available for review. I signed it with my name only, no title, no credentials, just Edward Williams. I read the draft twice, checking each word for anything that could be misinterpreted as a threat or an accusation. Then I pressed send. The responses began arriving within seconds, some confused, some hostile, several simply asked what this was about. I answered none of them. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Debbie Bailey. I let it ring through to voicemail, She called again, then again. The fourth call came from a number I didn't recognize, likely Bradley trying from his cell. I silenced the phone and set it on the kitchen counter. Through the window, I could see the streetlights of Pinewood Hills beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the neighborhood. Somewhere in one of those houses, Debbie was reading my email and calculating her options. For the first time in weeks, she didn't control the timeline. She didn't know what I had or what I planned to reveal. The uncertainty would be unfamiliar to her, uncomfortable in ways she hadn't experienced since consolidating her grip on this community 8 years ago. I turned away from the window and began organizing the documents into folders, one for each category of evidence, each labeled with dates and descriptions. Saturday was 2 days away. There was still work to do. The inauguration ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning under a sky so blue it felt borrowed from a postcard. City Hall's front steps had been decorated with bunting and folding chairs, a modest arrangement befitting a town of 28,000 people who mostly wanted their government to work quietly and stay out of their way. I stood at the podium in a suit I hadn't worn since my wife's funeral 4 years ago, my hand raised, repeating the oath of office administered by a circuit court judge who had known my father decades before. The crowd was larger than I expected, perhaps 200 people spread across the lawn, some genuinely supportive, others merely curious about the man whose name had appeared in unflattering headlines just days before. I spotted Bradley Bailey near the back, his expression carefully neutral, his wife notably absent. He left before the applause ended. I shook hands, posed for photographs, answered questions with the careful vagueness that public officials learn to deploy when they have other things on their mind. No one asked about Pinewood Hills. No one mentioned the Gazette article. For 90 minutes, I was simply the new mayor of Cedarville. The rest would come soon enough. Saturday arrived with the weight of inevitability. The community clubhouse filled faster than any HOA meeting in memory, residents claiming seats and lining walls until the fire code became a suggestion rather than a rule. I counted 83 people, nearly 2/3 of Pinewood Hills households represented. Harold Jenkins sat in his usual back corner, arms crossed, watching with the patience of a man who had waited years for this moment. Rita Santos had positioned herself near the exit, ready to leave if necessary, but unwilling to miss what was about to happen. Debbie Bailey occupied her customary seat at the front table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, projecting the calm authority of someone who had controlled this room for 8 years and saw no reason why tonight should be any different. Bradley sat directly behind her, arms folded across his chest, jaw set in a hard line. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I stood near the projector I had set up an hour earlier, waiting for the clock to reach 7. At exactly 7 o'clock, I walked to the front of the room. Debbie immediately began speaking, asserting that board meetings required proper notice, and this gathering had not been sanctioned through official channels. I let her finish without interruption. Then I addressed the room without acknowledging her objection. I explained that I was not speaking as mayor tonight. I was speaking as a resident of Pinewood Hills, exercising rights guaranteed under Article 12.7 of our own governing documents. 22 homeowners had signed a petition for a formal audit. Tonight, I would share what that audit had already begun to reveal. I clicked on the first slide, HOA expenditures from 2019 through 2023. Total payments to Bailey Property Services, $127,000. I asked the room if anyone could describe what improvements had been made to justify this spending. Silence. Debbie shifted in her seat. The second slide showed Harold's photographs of the clubhouse parking lot, each image time-stamped across 3 years. The surface was identical in every photo, yet the HOA had paid $12,000 for resurfacing in 2021. I asked Debbie to explain. Her response came measured but thin. She suggested photographic evidence could be misleading, and maintenance records required professional interpretation. The third slide changed everything. Business registration results for Greenfield Paving. The company listed on the resurfacing invoice. The company did not exist. The registered address was a vacant lot on the outskirts of Cedarville. I let that information settle. A murmur rippled through the audience. I advanced to the next slide, 3 more vendors with identical profiles. Addresses lead nowhere. Business registrations are returning no results. Invoices for work that left no visible trace. Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that silenced the murmuring. He declared these accusations were defamatory and that I would be hearing from their attorney. I told him he was welcome to contact any attorney he chose. I also noted that all documents shown tonight would be submitted to the North Carolina Attorney General's office on Monday morning, along with a formal request for investigation. The room erupted. Residents turned to each other, voices rising, questions flying toward the front table where Debbie sat increasingly isolated. Her two allied board members had shifted their chairs away from her, creating visible distance. Someone demanded to know where the money had actually gone. Another asked whether dues would be refunded if fraud was proven. A third called for Debbie's immediate resignation. Through it all, Debbie remained seated, her composure cracking in small ways, a tremor in her hands, a flush climbing her neck, eyes darting toward exits blocked by people who were no longer her allies. Then she made her mistake. She stood and pointed directly at me. Her voice cut through the chaos, sharp enough to silence the room. She called me a liar who had refused to support the community from the day I arrived. She reminded everyone that I had denied her fuel for an HOA vehicle and screamed at her until she feared for her safety. She accused me of orchestrating this entire spectacle as personal revenge. The room went quiet. Every face turned toward me, waiting for a response. I said nothing. I reached into my folder, produced a flash drive, and inserted it into the laptop. The security footage from my gas station began to play. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. No screaming, no threats. Just a woman demanding free gasoline and calling the police when refused. The room watched in complete silence as Debbie's narrative collapsed frame by frame. When the video ended, no one moved. Debbie stood frozen at the front, her accusations still hanging in the air, now contradicted by evidence everyone had witnessed. Someone in the back laughed bitterly. Someone else whispered they couldn't believe it. I told the room that copies of all documents would be available at the door. I encouraged anyone with questions to attend the Board of Commissioners meeting on Wednesday, where I would request a formal review of HOA practices across Cedarville. I thanked them for their time and stepped away. Debbie remained standing, alone. Bradley was already gone. Her board members refused to meet her eyes. Harold Jenkins walked past her toward the exit, pausing just long enough to deliver 4 words. "You should have listened." I gathered my materials and left through the side door. The night air hit my face, cool and sharp. Behind me, voices still rose from inside, neighbors finally confronting 8 years of silence. My phone buzzed, a text from my lawyer filing prepared for Monday. Confirmation requested. I typed 1 word confirmed. 3 weeks passed before the dust began to settle into something resembling a new normal. The North Carolina Attorney General's office moved faster than I had expected, assigning an investigator to review the financial documents within 5 business days of my formal complaint. The investigator, a methodical woman named Patricia Vance, interviewed Harold Jenkins first, then Rita Santos, then a dozen other residents who had quietly accumulated their own grievances over the years. She requested and received full access to HOA bank records, vendor contracts, and meeting minutes dating back to 2017. What she found confirmed what Harold and I had already pieced together, a systematic pattern of payments to shell companies, fabricated invoices for work never performed, and a reserve fund that had been drained by over $140,000 across 6 years. The scope was larger than even Harold had suspected. Debbie Bailey had not simply been skimming, she had been operating a small empire of fraud, hidden beneath the procedural respectability of community governance. Debbie resigned from the HOA board 4 days after the community meeting. There was no announcement, no farewell letter, no attempt to spin the departure as a personal choice. She simply stopped appearing at functions, stopped answering calls from board members, and stopped existing as a public presence in Pinewood Hills. Her resignation letter, when it finally arrived at the HOA's registered address, consisted of 3 sentences and no explanation. The 2 board members who had supported her throughout also resigned within the week, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. An emergency election was scheduled for December. Harold Jenkins declined to run, but agreed to serve as an advisory consultant to whoever took over. The new board's first official act was to suspend all pending fines against residents and commission an independent audit of every financial transaction since 2015. My $500 violation for conduct detrimental to community harmony was among the first to be formally rescinded. Officer Bobby Pullman's situation resolved itself through channels I never touched. The Cedarville Police Department opened an internal investigation after my lawyer forwarded the security footage showing Pullman's late-night surveillance of my gas station, along with documentation of his rapid response to Debbie's 911 call and his failure to review available evidence at the scene. I made no public statements about him. I filed no formal complaint. I simply provided information when asked and let the system work. 2 weeks later, Pullman was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's conclusion. The charges under consideration included conduct unbecoming of an officer and failure to follow departmental protocols for dispute calls. Whether anything would come of it remained uncertain. Police accountability moved slowly in small towns, but the investigation existed, the documentation was clear, and Pullman would have to answer for the choices he had made while believing no one was watching. Bradley Bailey's dealership saw a measurable decline in traffic during the weeks following the community meeting. I noticed fewer of his advertisements in the Cedarville Gazette, fewer sponsorship banners at local events. Whether this reflected genuine community rejection or simply the awkwardness of associating with a family under investigation, I couldn't say. I made no effort to encourage any boycott. I never mentioned his name in public forums. Whatever consequences came to Bradley would come from the market and from legal processes. Not from any campaign of mine. He and Debbie remained in their house on Pinewood Lane. No one forced them out. No one vandalized their property. They simply became quieter, smaller, less visible in a community that had once organized itself around their preferences. I saw Debbie once, at the grocery store on Maple Street, 3 weeks after everything collapsed. She was alone, pushing a cart through the cereal aisle, her face drawn and pale. Our eyes met briefly. I nodded, the same polite acknowledgement I would offer any neighbor. She looked away and continued down the aisle. That was enough. I had no interest in her humiliation. I had only ever wanted the truth to be known. The gas station recovered gradually, then suddenly, Mrs. Martha Flores remained loyal throughout, arriving every Wednesday for gas and coffee as though nothing had changed. Tommy got his delivery schedules restored after suppliers received assurances that the business was stable. New customers appeared, some from Pinewood Hills, others from neighboring communities who had heard the story and wanted to support a local owner who had stood up to corruption. By late November, daily transactions had returned to their previous levels and showed signs of exceeding them. I hired a part-time assistant to help Tommy during peak hours. On the day she started, I finally replaced the old sign out front that had faded over the years of sun and rain. The new sign read Williams's Gas and Go, serving the community since 1987. Below it, in smaller letters, I added a line my father used to say, fair prices, no exceptions. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December from an address I didn't recognize. The sender identified herself as a resident of a community called Lakewood Terrace, located 20 miles south of Cedarville. She had read about what happened in Pinewood Hills. Her HOA was experiencing similar problems, unexplained fees, selective enforcement, and board members who seemed to operate without oversight. She wanted to know if I had any advice, any resources, any guidance for someone who didn't know where to start. I read the message twice, then I began typing a response. I explained that I wasn't an expert in HOA reform, just a resident who had documented everything and refused to be silenced. I told her about Article 12.7 in most HOA bylaws, about public records requests, and about the importance of finding allies who shared her concerns. I attached a template for an audit petition and a link to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Portal. I told her that the process was slow and frustrating, and sometimes felt hopeless, but systems could be changed by people willing to use them properly. Before I sent the message, I paused. This wasn't the ending I had imagined when Debbie Bailey first walked into my gas station demanding free fuel. But maybe it was the right one, not a conclusion, a beginning. I pressed send and turned back to the work waiting on my desk.